venit, vă rog să luați un loc. Suntem un pic în întârziere, așa că va trebui să ne gândim. So I will switch to English. Thank you all for coming to this event. As is quite obvious, the conference takes place in the context of the LBDAL campaign, in which we are asking the Romanian state to cut its ties with other systems, the biggest private Israeli arms manufacturers, but also for the Romanian state to cut its military transfers towards and from Israel, because as we have heard in the panel before, Romania is also a very big buyer of Israeli technology. We have, of course, the almost €2 billion contract that was signed last year with Rafale defense systems, also from Israel. Why we believe it's important to have this conference was that after we launched the campaign, it became quite obvious, quite fast, that the issue was not just Elbit Systems, that this company doesn't function in a void, that there is a whole system that works behind companies like Elbit, like Rafale, like EIE, but also the American giants who have been very involved in the genocide, like Lockheed Martin, like Boeing. A system that is not just supplying arms to states that are the one to buy them, but a system that actually has agency within the system, and that plays a very active part in actually perpetuating conflict and war, so they can basically develop their markets, because they are selling debts, so they need to perpetuate debts to have this conflict. So I'm really glad we have here today 4 speakers. We are joined by Laëtitia Sédou. She's part of the European Networks Against the Arms Trade. We will have Caterina Anastasiou, who's part of Transform Europe, and also she's a coordinator in the Stop Rearm coalition that has been very active in recent times to try to counteract the militarization of the European Union and the European continent in general. We have Feinstein, who is one of the leading experts on investigative journalism within the military arms field. And we will have our very own who she's part of the campaign with her organization Social Housing Now, but she's also part of the Socialist Vision Group, and she's been one of the very few, unfortunately, academics in Romania that had a very significant and concrete stance against militarization, but also against the genocide in Gaza and the broader war in the region. So I will give the word to Laëtitia, and then we keep the same format. Each speaker has about 12-15 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks a lot for inviting me and for organizing this really amazing event from what I can see so far. So I'll start by trying to map a bit what's the European rearmament process about. Some things have been said already by previous speakers, so I'll skip few elements, but I think it's important to have in mind key characteristics, which I think are very useful also arguments to counter the official narrative that this is all done in order to protect us from a Russian threat. So the first element, of course, that has been said already is that this has started way before 2022. Claudia already mentioned some elements about the EU defense policies, as they call it. Very precisely, if we speak about rearmament policy in the sense of subsidizing the arms industry, the first concrete funding came in 2016, but of course, to get there, you need also at least a decade of behind-the-scenes preparatory work. So we can see that this comes from quite an early stage. Another important element I will insist on is that these officially named defense policies are mainly industry-driven policies. And that's not just for interest or interpretation from us, it's because it's enshrined structurally in those policies. The EU, common EU, like the European Commission, the common EU budget, cannot be used for defense purposes. The Commission does not have competence on defense matters, so that sounds a bit weird. Why do we have then very concrete funding for rearmament? Because it's all justified on the legal basis of industry, globally speaking. Competitiveness of the industry including global competitiveness, which means selling abroad. So it's a completely industry frame we have, which means very concretely when we are told we have a commissioner for defense, Mr. Corbinius, it's not true. We have a commissioner for the arms industry. We have a directorate for the defense industry and space. And to make it very clear, what does that mean? That means that it's like if instead of having a commissioner for health, we would have a commissioner for the pharmaceutical industry. And here we don't have the same name. You know, defense and defense industry, you have the same name, you think it's about defense. It's not. Health and pharmaceutical industry, we know very well it's not the same thing. And here we are facing the same situation. And I think it's important to have that as a strong argument to explain what's really happening. And a third element also, so just before moving on, this of course largely defines the type of policies we have. And I'll come back to that about the role of the industry, because that's key, of course. Now, what about 2022? What happened at that moment? Well, you can imagine this was the perfect justification and argument for an acceleration of the process, and even a post-justification to a certain extent. So the acceleration happened both in volume and in scope. In volume, because we had an exponential increase of the amounts that were dedicated to rearmament policies and to the arms industry in particular. We started 10 years ago with $500 million. We are today with a budget which is at least 12 to 13 billion from the EU common budget only. And there are new things adding all the time. And of course, on top of it, we have now something that many of you may have heard of, which is the SAFE plan under this Rearm Europe program. The SAFE plan is a 150 billion pot of loans that the European Commission is now giving to member states who are requiring it to allow them to buy weapons. So we can see that this is really something increasing very, very strongly, and as Claire was mentioning, there is from 2028 we will have a competitiveness fund which will dedicate at least 130 billion to the arms industry. And all this comes on top of the national military spending, which, as you may have heard too, there are strong incentives to push member states, collectively the EU 27, to spend 800 billion euros extra from what they currently already spent in the next 4 years. So these are really huge amounts of money. The acceleration in terms of scope, this is referring to the fact that those first policies in 2016 started with funding research and development. So the arms industry and private research centers to develop the next generation of weaponry. And then from 2022, the arms industry could become much more vocal to claim that they need also support for the next steps. So they started to get funding for the production, in particular for the production of ammunition, and also to the acquisition phase. First to buy weapons jointly together, and then this report I mentioned of 150 billion for member states to buy weaponry. So you could see also that there was an acceleration in that space, which were proposals already in the pipelines, in the air, but discrete. And the war in Ukraine has been the perfect excuse to put that at the front. And the arms industry came with a narrative which was saying that, okay, if you want democracy and sustainability, including environmental sustainability, you need stability. And for stability, you need security. And for security, you need weapons. That means that weapons are sustainable, democratic, and good for society. And they really made this shortcut. And this shortcut was completely accepted and used by many EU leaders to justify subsidizing more this industry, but also, as it was mentioned before, to open then the European Investment Bank, for example, and Sustainable Finance Global to the arms industry. So today, very concretely, if any of you has sufficient money to invest and ask for sustainable investment to your bank today can propose you sustainable portfolios where you can have nuclear weapons being funded through it, and where you can have unmanned autonomous weapons, drones, and then contribute to a certain extent to develop fully autonomous weapons, kill robot style, with your money, so-called sustainable. So this is really something that we can see moving very fast and is going very far. Now, of course, this is happening largely under an overall influence of the arms industry. And I think it's important to think about who is influencing and who is also profiting. We know that, globally speaking, the lobbying of the industry at large across EU policies is important, across sectors in the EU. But it seems from the organization really following about those issues that the arms industry is particularly efficient in terms of getting the results they want on that. The first reason is this issue of legal basis I mentioned. The fact that those policies are purely defined as industry, and we have a commissioner for the defense industry and a directorate for the defense industry, means that they only talk to the defense industry. They don't talk to civil society, they don't talk to peace groups. If I come back to the comparison with health, well, the commissioner for health, whether he likes it or not, has to speak with non-profit organizations dealing with health. This is not happening at defense. So they have a completely open venue with little opposition. The second element, of course, is that they have a very symbiotic relationship for many of them with their national governments. So that makes also their life much easier because they are also kind of defended by their own governments, each fighting for their own national industry. So there are many structures. Lobbying, many times people think about hidden bilateral meetings behind the door, etc. But the truth is that for the arms industry, it's very formalized and structured. You have at least 3 or 4 times a year big European conferences where the major CEOs of the arms industry, the main EU officials, ministers, etc., would gather and discuss and be very friendly. They know each other very well. Discuss about all these measures and what the arms industry needs. It's all about answering their needs. You have structured dialogues. The European Commission, before even putting the text on the table, for example, recently there's had proposals about deregulating the sector of the arms industry on different aspects, and they even consult them in advance. They don't consult civil society, they don't consult peace groups or critical groups, but they consult the arms industry even in advance. So it should be something which goes very far. And then if you go to who is profiting, and Claire was mentioning at the beginning of her presentation this group of personalities, which was dominated by the arms industry. Today it has been turned into a more formal expert group, which is again a group consulted regularly by the Commission, made up of arms companies and their associations representing their interests. Where you can see that among the top 10 or 15 main beneficiaries of this funding, you find those people from the group of personalities. You have 15 companies that get more than half of the money for the research and development, for example, for this European Defence Fund. This is the one we have most transparency on so far, so that's where we can have this visualization. There are about more than 1,000 beneficiaries in total, but 15 get more than half of the money. So we can see that this is also funding for the big major companies, which are already very powerful, which are already many times internationalized, globalized, not only European, and which are also the main exporters outside Europe. So we see their kind of coherence, I would say. And if you look at it from a perspective of nationality, where they are based, officially at least, we can see that, again, this big part of the European Defence Fund, 2/3 of the money goes to 4 countries. And I guess we can all quote them. France, Germany, Italy, Spain. Again, these are the big military players. They are the ones with the biggest industries, and they are the ones who are exporting more. While you could see maybe they are not the ones who would need more money, also that per se. And of course, that's also is a contradiction with what is the EU supposed to be. The EU is not supposed to be a pot for a bunch of people who are already powerful or already the biggest military powers. It's supposed to be something to help across countries to get to the same level of living or quality of life, etc., etc. So this is also an important element of it. And I would conclude with what this is all for, what is behind the fear narrative. So of course, as I mentioned, it's for the interest of the arms industry, but I think we can go even a bit further than that. The fear narrative, of course, has been a perfect argument to make people accept those policies, and in particular increasing military spending at the expenses of the rest of public policies, of the austerity measures that are now going with across Europe. And it's interesting to see that one of the reasons for that is that also among the proposals of the Young Europe plan, there is the fact that now military spending is considered good debt. You know that the EU obliged member states to not go over a certain threshold of debt. But the military spending will not be counted into that, for example, in the next 4 years at least, and it will be renewable. So they can go have more debt, so that will be, of course, very easy to spend more in military spending and not education. So education, your health is a burden, but weapons are an asset. So that's also something quite strong, I think. And of course, at some point, they will come back to the normal, so we will have to reimburse that debt. So again, they will cut even more into public policies in any case. So that's part of the problem. And then if you want to go even beyond that, and it has been kind of already touched upon in the previous presentation, but I think it's very important that it's not only just a political analysis from a peace angle or from leftist people or whatever. They are very clearly written, it's really clearly written in EU official documents that in the end, this militarization is becoming a necessity for the survival of an economic model which is arriving to its expiration date, I would say, or to its end of its efficiency. It's really something you can easily see from the 2025 EU white paper on defense. So parallel to the Young Europe plan, they issued this white paper on defense, where they presented the investment in arms as the only way today to promote or to preserve European competitiveness. Competitiveness of the industry, of course, that's the way the plan. The tool to preserve growth and jobs of all European industry. But in fact, what is written there is that the point is to remain in the technological race against the US and against China. Of course, it's not against Russia, but in the technological race. So it's really the idea of to keep really at this race of innovation and technological competition, which means we need the access to the raw materials that go together with this technological race and innovation. So we can see there already that we arrived to a point where we can see this militarization as a new wave of wars we need to preserve access to the resources we need in the rest of the world, because we don't want to have mines in our own countries, so they have to be taken from somewhere else, and there we know we are in rivalry with the US and with China. And it's really, again, something that is written black and white. They write black and white that this is about preserving our economic hegemony. We are really into something that this militarization is intrinsically connected with the fact of preserving this Western imperialism, white supremacy, call it whatever you want, but it's all that together. We need the military power for that. This is the main objective of it. This is absolutely not about the Russian threat. I would say that whether the Russian threat is true or not is not even the point, because this is not done for that.
Thank you, Laëtitia, for the insightful presentation. I think it's quite important to actually highlight this kind of Europe of two speeds, because now they're talking about it again. And it's very visible in the way that Romania is handling the SAFE project. We are loaning about 15 billion euros, and most of the money is going to Germany, with a bit of money going to France, almost. They say that they will move production here, but we all know that that's not really what's happening, and they're bringing here assembly lines and basically just like the finalization of the product, not really manufacturing no real jobs. So thank you. So I'll give the word to Pat next.
Hello everyone, I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank again the people organizing this conference. I think it's important we meet outside Europe's central cities more frequently, also because our reality whether we like it or not, are quite different between the Central European countries and what they call periphery. So thanks for being here. I'm going to pick it up from where Laëtitia took it, but also the panel before. Laëtitia already mentioned the names of the current arms procurement programs: Rearm Europe, Readiness 2030, SAFE. And I'm repeating them because I think it is really important in our struggle, like it was said before, not only to connect with other struggles, like housing struggle or the struggle for access to health, but it's very, very important to understand that language matters. Because language matters, last year when the Rearm Europe plan was introduced for the first 2 weeks, called Rearm Europe plan, we gathered up forces among organizations of the peace movement, but also broader than that, and we created a campaign called Stop Rearm Europe. I'm going to talk about that towards the end a little bit more, but within 2 weeks of our call, the European Union decided to change the name because Rearming Europe didn't appeal so much in the public, and they renamed the program Readiness 2030 because we need to be ready by 2030. We're going to be invaded, right? It is evident and it is clear that what we experience right now is the materialized fear by European elites and Western elites. I would connect it to the US and Australia and the UK at this point, of losing hegemony over the world. And by losing hegemony over the world in material terms for working class people is losing the right to decide who is allowed to live in dignity and who isn't. Because if we're really honest about the part of the world we come from, it's all about that choice. Who is allowed to live in dignity, who isn't. And our role is, unfortunately, not only to stop them being genocidal towards the Palestinians, the Yemeni, and many other peoples around the world, but at the same time, while fighting this development, it is our responsibility to give birth to another world and another Europe that will have other objectives that are more close to our moral, I would say, in this case, values. So, because language again is important, and it has been, I'm trying not to repeat what was said in the first panel, but it's difficult because quite a lot of things were said already. Because language is important, and we are the ones responsible for giving birth to this new world, it is also important to understand that every time this security question is put above our head, our main responsibility is to ask, whose security are we talking about? Because this is a question that nobody asks, and this is a question that is silent. Whose security against whom or towards whom? I am pretty sure, I mean, I don't read Romanian newspapers, but I'm pretty sure if we would sit down, a couple of us, and take experts of the newspapers from countries around Europe, the arguments we will find arguing for this kind of militarization programs at the expense of everyday people would be the same. Probably with some cultural nuances here and there, but the arguments would be the same. We need to be safe, we are under imminent threat. The European way of life is under imminent threat. This is the kind of argumentation. And as I said again, we need to find the language that enables us to act together in this. In the Stop Rearm Europe campaign, which Albert out here in Romania is part of, we're trying to do exactly that. We're trying to connect all issues. Now, for this year, in June, we're calling for a month of mobilizations under the common slogan, welfare, not warfare, and I want to explain that a little bit, because it's not that we are oblivious to what is happening in Palestine or oblivious to all the other horrible crimes our governments are committing around the world. its nature, but it is for a fact that safety, to feel safe, is a need. And it is a need that transcends everyone and also the working classes. You need to feel safe. And if you could, I think, translate the privileges we have here inside the European Union, let's say in a global language, we do have the privilege, for example, that if we go on our way to work, we have a car accident, we can be sure somebody will care and an ambulance will arrive. This is the kind of everyday safety that people need and strive for, and this is why they're so easily manipulated by fear and the far right. And if you notice again this kind of propagandistic language, what they're trying to do is always other the fear, no? It's not your government going through austerity measures that decimate your healthcare system. It's the poor migrant that is coming illegally in your country and taking away from your child. So we need to be the translators in this society. We need to break down, we need to take the need to feel safe seriously, and this can only happen if we unite our struggles. And welfare, not warfare, does exactly that, because what does it say? It says, we want to have a state that is for the citizens and not for the elites. We want to have the right for public education, public health care, and some good infrastructure, and so on and so on. And this is not compatible with the direction you're taking us into and the direction you have been on to the last 20 years. Because as long as we militarize to this extent, we're not only not serving the need to feel safe in your everyday life, but we're also becoming a threat to the rest of the world. Just a couple of days ago, the CIPRI report was published with the new numbers of militarization. Laëtitia know more about numbers than me, but it is terrifying the amount of resources that go into the business of killing others. And we have a responsibility to our future to stop this, and the change happens first here. So I would like to invite those of you that are able to join us in Brussels on the 14th of June, where we want to have a European Assembly. And I want to invite those of you that are not able to travel to stage something here in Romania. Take the month of June, find a date that is comfortable for you, the day in which you can mobilize and join us. It is really, really important that we take on this struggle together. And when organizing this, I urge you to look outside your usual political cycle. Go talk to the parish of the church. Go talk to a cultural association of women that does embroidery. Go and talk to everybody and explain to them what is going on right now. And just to conclude, and Laëtitia said it as well, this Rearm Europe plan, we're not talking about money that is already there and is going to be spent in something else because that need is more urgent. We're talking about debt that is going to be accumulated in order, again, to empower the very death machine that is responsible for climate change, for the collapse of the international law, and the wars against the planet. Imagine that I'm Greek. I mean, you know what happened in Greece after 2008, and 2010, and 2015. We were told we're not allowed to have good quality healthcare, we're not entitled to labor rights, we're not entitled to public education because we're Greeks and we're lazy and we like to lay in the sun. This noted by Germans at that time. And now we're 11 years later, or 10 years later, the German government decides to stop its policy of low public debts, not to help the struggling German people, because it's not good if we generalize. There are 10 million people in Germany living under the poverty line, not to help them, but because they made a promise to themselves to be once again, and here I'm quoting their chancellor, the biggest army in Europe. And this must be unsettling to everyone. So yeah, join us in June, and yes, I hope we talk also later. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. I think this point you're making about language is so important because I think it's often overlooked the way that this process of manufacturing consent for military investment happens. And we have seen it in Romania when the Romanian state signed a contract for 2 billion euros with Rafael. The news were selling it as Romania is buying the Iron Dome. And it was completely crazy, because I mean, the system itself had nothing to do with the Iron Dome, just came from Israel, but it was presented as the Iron Dome because it's something that has been paraded so much in the news that people associate with safety. And they think that, okay, everything we buy from Israel is foolproof, it's impenetrable, so yeah, we can make this sacrifice. Yeah. So thank you. Andrew, give the word to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations to everyone involved in organising this event. I think it's such an important event. And thank you all for being here and for being a part of this struggle. The Marine Corps General Smedley Butler said at the end of his career, war is a racket. He admitted that he'd spent his career effectively making the world available to American corporations to profiteer. If anything, the situation has got worse. And I want to take just one element of what has been sketched here on this panel so far, which is the extent to which the arms trade that drives conflict dominates our politics and our political decisions. This dimension of profiteering is not separate from the white supremacist imperialist geopolitics of our countries in the so-called Western world, but actually is a key dimension and motivator of it. And I think it's really important for us to understand that as we tackle companies like Elbit Systems and the politics that allows them to thrive. My organization, which is called Shadow World Investigations, my colleague Ruth Rowley is here with me for this event. We are working on a book that will come out in November this year called Making a Killing: How the West Profits from Slaughter in Gaza and Yemen. I've been investigating this area for 25 years now. I have never worked on anything as appalling as this work we have done on Yemen and Gaza, and identifying the gargantuan sums of money that are being made by companies, by individuals, by intermediaries, from the slaughter of tens of thousands of innocent people in places like Gaza and Yemen. To give you an indication in the current time of how this manifests, if we take three of the biggest American defense companies, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and RTX, or Raytheon, as some of you might know, three companies who are very prominent in Europe as well. On the first day of the strikes against Iran, the shareholders of those companies, on that one day alone, saw the value of their shares increase by between 25 and $30 billion. So are hundreds of young schoolgirls are being murdered by the products of these companies. their shareholders are becoming exponentially richer in that exact moment. That is how the world in which we live now works. On that same day, Elbit Systems briefly became Israel's most valuable listed company, with its shares increasing by 45% since January of this year. In Europe and the UK, on that day, and for the weeks following it, defense company share prices surged. War is a racket. In addition to that, all three of Donald Trump's wastrel sons, who've never done a day's work in their lives, became tens of millions of dollars richer. Why? Because they all invested millions in companies that they knew within days of the first attack on Iran were going to go from being unknown companies to getting huge multi-million-dollar contracts from the Pentagon that was under the control of their father. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, his broker, in the hours before the attack on Iran, with insider information, was trying to build up Hegseth's portfolio in the companies that were going to directly benefit from that attack. When we take that together with the fact that the trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in the world, 40%. And it does that as a consequence of the fact that everything that happens on these deals takes place behind a curtain of national security imposed secrecy, which is why when we published The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, as long ago as 2011, it was the first book published on the global arms trade since 1979. Because you take enormous risks to put any of this information into the public domain. And crucially, all of the actors in this sector know that they are acting with impunity. We recorded in The Shadow World the fact that up to, I think it was the beginning of 2011, there'd been over 500 violations of US arms embargoes by companies and individuals who had profited from violating those embargoes. There had been any investigation or trial of one of those. An arms dealer who was found guilty of violating an embargo, he in fact violated 2 embargoes with the same deal, said to me, first of all, it was an immoral conviction. Second of all, the fine that he was given wasn't even pocket change for him. These people act with impunity in their own parallel legal universe. And how do they do that? It's because this business, the weapons business, is so inextricably linked to our states, to our governments, to our political parties, and to our politicians. And it's crucially important that we understand that this industry has effectively bought and paid for our politicians and our political systems. Political defense companies, across a period since the Second World War, are either always first or second in the largest quantum of donations made to political parties. In the United States of America, it's a system that we describe as legalized bribery, where we can trace the money because it is legal. In the EU and the United Kingdom, it is illegal, but happens constantly despite that. And don't for a moment think that it's just the political parties. And political parties of every political stripe. In Germany, it doesn't matter whether the SDP or the CDU are in power. In Britain, it doesn't matter whether the Conservatives or the Labour Party are in power. Their biggest donors are always linked to the arms trade and more recently to Israel. And the individuals benefit too, the individual politicians. They're not necessarily corrupted while they're in office, but they know if they make the right decisions while they are in office, they will be very well rewarded for it once they've left office. So someone like Tony Blair, by 2011, so we're talking about 15 years out of date now, he had personally made over £110 million, directly or indirectly, from the decision to invade Iraq and from his work with British and American arms companies. So this has a profound effect on the policies that our governments are making. Because to keep this corruption going, to keep our political parties funded, to keep our politicians wealthy. Do any of you remember a former senior politician who is not wealthy? And to keep them in this situation, we need to be constantly increasing our defense budgets, our subsidies to the defense companies. And therefore, we have to have permanent enemies and continuous conflict. Otherwise, the whole pack of cards collapses. A world in which everything is perceived through a militarist mindset was described by the American philosopher C. Wright Mills as a world of a military metaphysic. And that is what we are living in today. We are seeing by these ridiculous numbers from the EU that Laëtitia was talking about. The only thing that our governments think is going to engender any growth in our sclerotic economies is military Keynesianism, is more and more defense spending. In a book that you can access on our website at shadowworldinvestigations.org called Indefensible, 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade, we show the research that makes it absolutely clear that defense spending doesn't contribute to growing economies, it is a drag on growth. That it is the most inefficient way to create new jobs. But the reality is, because of the corrupt nature of our political system, we live in the best democracies that money can buy. But it goes further. Our governments are willing to undermine the rule of law domestically to protect these defense companies, to protect Elbit systems, and to protect the genocidal state of Israel. We're seeing in the United Kingdom peaceful organizations and individuals opposed to genocide are being prescribed and charged as terrorists. In just the same way, my former boss Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Now, if you oppose a genocide, you are a terrorist. Why? Because it is our government and our politicians who are enabling and facilitating that genocide, which is the real terrorism that is taking place in our world. The targeting of Elbit systems is incredibly important, both symbolically but also practically, because of the role it plays in Israel's military-industrial complex. And our objective has to be to get Elbit systems not just out of Romania, but out of all of our countries. In the United Kingdom, because of what activists have done, 3 of Elbit's 10 factories in the country have been closed down. And as we are doing this, as was stated on the previous panel, the most powerful tool we have is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I say this from the personal experience of having been involved in the South African struggle against apartheid. What played more of a role to end apartheid than anything else was PDAs. And because Israel was apartheid South Africa's closest ally, Israel has learned from the South African experience, which is why the Israeli government and all of its corrupt supporters around the world identify support for BDS as anti-Semitic. While those of us, even Jews like myself, the son of a Holocaust survivor, know that it is in the very best tradition of the lesson that we learned from the Holocaust, the lesson of never again, that makes BDS such an important and powerful tool in our struggle to get Elbit systems the hell out of our countries. Thank you.
I think you're making a very important point that we need to understand this relationship between arms dealers and politicians as one that goes both ways. That's not just a state that is buying weapons, but that the manufacturers have this kind of influence. Because too many times the weapon companies, they're portraying this kind of very technocratic way. They're just producing, now they're producing technology, because we have seen that dual-use items like drones play a very important role in modern warfare. And because of this, they get away. I mean, politicians, they have to at least respond in the elections for the towards the people, but the arms dealers don't. So I think it's really important to make this kind of connection. So Eniko, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Vlad. I'm really very honored to be invited amongst these very prestigious speakers. I just hope that I can add some ideas to ones that were already mentioned, or maybe put them in a larger scheme or whatever, we'll see. So I speak about the complicity between warfare state and the private military companies and military trade, a complicity for the defense of capitalism. And I'm also going to give an example of Romania as a semi-periphery country. So I'm going to touch on 4 big questions. First, giving some statistical arguments for the idea that was already put here, which is that militarization or the increase in military spending actually makes more war, because that's the logic of this business. Afterwards, I will synthesize some arguments about why militarization is one of the most efficient instruments for defending capitalism. Thirdly, I will speak about the big winners of the financialized military-industrial complex. And fourthly, some thoughts about what is the role of Romania in all this story. So let us see this table, which puts together many information, some narratives, some statistics, but it is to reflect how in the history of the United States, the politics of Western imperialism actually went together with the increasing amount of investment in militarization. So there were always wars. After the Second World War, it was only us in Europe who thought that we are living in peace. But actually, there were many wars, and there was also a war against communism. The Truman Doctrine actually framed it like that. And it was one of the main arguments for militarization during those times. And we can see an increase of military spending from 1950, from $14 billion to $306 billion in 1990. The Clinton era, which was the kind of post-Cold War period start, was about rethinking the engaging in war, but actually even during those times in the 1990s, 2000s, the United States was involved in military operations, among others in Serbia, we know. And we can also see how also, this post-Cold War period still had an improved effect, if you wish, on military spending. So there was a decrease in military spending, for example, globally from 6% to 3% in the decade between 1986 1999. The 2000s happened under the frame of war against terrorism. That was the argument for militarization, which knew a huge increase in military spending, up to $954 million in last year, which, well, already these spendings are reflecting the investments into military to support Ukraine against Russia, actually to practice proxy war against Russia. Now, the Donroe Doctrine changed the focus of the United States, but still the logic is the same, the need for militarization. The focus is on China and its allies, against them. And also a very big pressure on increasing military spending of all the NATO countries. So we go further and ask this question: so why capitalism needs to be defended, and how militarization plays a role in this? So there are some basic contradictions and features of capitalist system which makes this logic functioning. Most importantly, the tension between the need for permanent growth and the limits of growth. Or other features would be the overaccumulation of capital and the falling rate of profit, which all make Western capital to look for newer and newer markets and spaces with cheap labor force, newer and newer natural resources, and obviously in this expansion, military conflicts are playing a crucial role. And I put here a few solutions to these systemic contradictions of capitalism. And among them, yes, it's good to remind that the use of military force was always a core feature of empires, from colonial times to the present. Then privatization, again, we know it was a process by which priorly non-private sectors became privatized and became a terrain of capital accumulation. Removing the obstacles to free trade and free movement of capital was again a feature of this attempt to solve the conflicts, contradictions of capitalism for the benefit of capital, obviously. And last but not least, as already was said, military Keynesianism is the policy which is used in order to create demand and to create markets for armaments. And how do you create demand? You create demand by warmongering international relations, by spreading a warrior mindset, by engaging in wars. And the state, in all this process, always acts as an investor and also as a buyer, as a consumer of armaments. So we go further and let us see how who are the most big winners of this military-industrial complex in financialized capitalism. And I put here three categories of winners: the armaments producers and sellers. And they were already mentioned here, the big three ones. Here I put the big five armament seller, producer and seller companies whose total net revenue in 2025 was over $214 billion. But it's not just that, because we are in a financialized capitalism. We are not surprised to see that asset management companies are also winners in this game. And they are transforming arms not only into commodities sold on the market, but into financial assets which are traded on stock exchange. And usually these three big asset management companies dominate also in the field of armaments, State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock. But also there are some specialized, more specialized asset management companies like iShares, Invesco, Global X, Defense Tech. And actually, yeah, what they do is that they pack shares into large portfolios, which include shares from different industries, from different sectors, among them the so-called defense sector. And unfortunately, they rely very much on pension funds. So even if we don't really know, and even if we don't really want, our retirement money goes into asset management companies which buy shares from these big arms producer and seller companies. And last but not least, the private equity firms and venture capital that finance, for example, startups in defense industry, and they are actually very much present in the world of defense contractors. And let us go to Eastern Europe and have a look a bit on Romania. I put here some figures which reflect the increase of military spending of the Romanian governments, which made that the investment into military increased from 1.3% of GDP over 2.4% of GDP in the past decade. And also we can see a change during years of who were were the major actors of arms transport and which were the countries where these arms companies exported. But what I want to emphasize here is about this what I call dependent militarization of Romania, which means that our defense policy and economy is very much subordinated to the needs of the core countries. Some examples for this are these government-to-government contracts with the United States and Norway. So money which goes to buy these Patriot missile systems and fighter jets and etc. and tanks and other armaments. Romania also acts as a frontier country due to its geopolitical place between the NATO, EU, core and the conflict zones of East. By the way, Elbit systems and Rheinmetall open factories in Romania, as we know, but as you can see, the high-value intellectual property remains in Germany. Romania has only one path, which is the integration into the Western military-industrial complex. It's the southern route for the NATO logistics hub 2026, part of the proxy war in Ukraine. Romania got or asked, or I don't know, the second largest amount of money from the SAFE program, but also from the US Foreign Military Financing Program. It also takes part in this so-called poor prioritized Ukraine requirements list, contributes with 50 million euros, and also signed this agreement about the new Ukraine support loan for the next two years. Okay, and my conclusions why warfare trade and military trade are interconnected. I have three basic conclusions. One is that the increase in military spending actually means that the states are de-risking investments into armaments and create markets for private capital, ensuring high rates of profitability for interconnected industrial and financial actors. Secondly, militarization is about how the states diverts public money for investments from welfare towards warfare, towards supporting ongoing wars or triggering new wars, etc. And actually serves the interests of financial and economic actors of the military-industrial complex. Thirdly, a conclusion related to the uneven development of the current capitalist world system is about how the semi-periphery countries are playing a role in all these financialized global military industrial system from their subordinate semi-peripheral position. So actually, we are called to defend capitalism and Western imperialism despite of our interests, which are the interests that all the people in the world have, which means welfare and not warfare. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I think it's very important to understand our position here in Romania because in many ways we are in a very contradictory position because we are also part of the core, part of the EU, but we're also on the margin, so we're not actually part of it. We are part where there's something to be gained from us, but I don't know, we haven't been yet in a situation when the EU needed to actually support us in any meaningful ways, but maybe we'll find out. But I think it's interesting because even if you look, as I mentioned before, at the military trade, I think even even though it's not such a big market, it's still an important place of value extraction. I mean, we see all these companies, all the now German, French companies, and also the Europeans that are coming through the state mechanisms. They are coming here and they are actually extracting value through this kind of deals because they are producing, but they're also exporting what's produced in Romania. And there's also, I think, especially in the near future, there will be this kind of brain drain. In Romania, there's a known fact that we have a lack of engineers, that there is a very big need for engineers to have basically an industrial system which is technologically modern and performant, not just to be a market, a logistics market for Europe. So I think it's important to keep in mind there is this kind of class dimension, that they are moving resources, but they're also moving labor force, to an industry that is actually unproductive for the general society. So that being said, if you have questions from the audience, feel free to raise your hand and I can come and give you the mic.
Yes, sorry, it's me again. I have a question, perhaps to Anastasia.
Katerina. Katerina, Anastasia with my last name.
Yes, sorry. Katerina. So I don't know how much you work you do in Greece, but you said you're Greek, and you gave a great perspective. And thinking about security, Greece's involvement with Israel is very troubling. Greece and Cyprus concluded this mutual defense treaty with Israel in December, right? And also there was this article on the Credo about the broader involvement of Israeli security companies with the states, the spyware, so on and so forth, the two big ports in Thessaloniki and Piraeus and so on. So what is being done in Greece with respect to this sort of deep involvement of the Greek state with Israeli defense interests?
Should I answer? Yes, there are two comrades here that live and work and are active in Greece, and I think they're going to talk about their campaigning tomorrow. They're sitting behind you. But obviously there is people trying to resist the current government in Greece. This government has been in charge of the country for 2 consecutive electoral periods, and they're sure they're going to make the third one. They're one of the most corrupt, deregulating government we've had in the so-called modern political era of Greece, post-dictatorship. It's really horrible, the situation. You're right in everything you said. The people that are on the street, they're trying to organize, but the situation is really, really, really bad. You have to understand, I know that, I would take it the other way around. I know, for example, that in Romania and Bulgaria there is a kind of euphoria now with entering the Schengen on, oh, we're in the same group with the big guys. I can tell you from the Greek experience, this is an illusion that you have to pay very expensively ahead on. The peoples of Greece are not their government. The government of Greece is complicit, horrible, and very corrupt. This is the answer that I can give you. It's how it is. Yeah. And maybe the two comrades of the bike can tomorrow, they're going to tell you more about how solidarity is organized in Greece.
So I guess my question here kind of combines a little bit about what was spoken here and in the previous panel, but also like my personal kind of experiences and professional activities, specifically within the field of culture. And I'm wondering if somebody could speak kind of broadly about the idea of cultural boycott as well as the effectiveness of cultural boycott. Andrew, perhaps you have some insight on that. And actually, even more specifically, my question isn't really about like a cultural boycott of Zionist artists or anything like that. It's actually the cultural boycott of complicit countries and governments, mainly of which is what I call like my former country of the United States, whose media and the power of the media there and its quote-unquote culture is very often intertwined, if not funded, by the government and military. For example, like Marvel films, you know, are actually almost majority funded by the US military and then turn into instruments of pro-militarized propaganda around. So, you know, I can acknowledge the fact that like a complete cultural boycott from a place like the United States, where it's just pure like oversaturation of its culture everywhere, but perhaps on a localized level, you know, if we see, for example, artists or something that are, you know, kind of on the wrong side of history here and are getting booked in whether screening venues or performance venues or whatever, or for example, if we have, let's say, a film festival or something that is specifically focused on American culture and American film, which does exist here, for example. I find all of these to be pretty problematic, and I'm wondering, again, broadly, the effectiveness of cultural boycott and sort of what you would recommend from like a grassroots perspective can be effective also.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I think that. Oh.
I think that's a great question. I was sort of thinking about this very recently. I was watching a screening of a new series about Nelson Mandela that's being made by a fairly commercial filmmaker that will appear on Netflix next year. And there was a scene about, I mean, most of you are probably too young to know this, but during the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, there was a whole movement called We Won't Play Sun City, because Sun City was this resort created in one of the so-called Bantustans in South Africa. And they could get very famous artists from around the world to perform at Sun City, paid them millions and millions. And they were able to say, well, we weren't in South Africa, we were in the independent homeland of Perpetuating, which, you know, was about the size of this table and had zero economic resources and some puppet leader they managed to take out of jail and put in charge of the country, so-called. An interesting thing about that whole movement was started by a musician called Steve Van Zandt, and he speaks a lot in the moment about how they came to this movement. Steve Van Zandt, who later in life has become a terrible actor, he's in some awful slapstick comedy series set in Norway, where he plays this mafioso from New York who lands up in the middle of nowhere in Norway. And it's really offensive at so many levels. And, you know, you won't be shocked to hear that Van Zandt is now a sort of a passionate Zionist who, when asked about the comparisons between apartheid South Africa and Israel, starts screaming that anybody who questions Israel in this way is obviously anti-Semitic. And it really, I was sitting there thinking, wow, you know, someone who had these sort of political sensibilities when he was in his 20s or whatever, is now a sort of an older, wealthy, privileged white person who's just gone back to the norm. It just made me think of the sort of, the arc of sort of some cultural workers. Cultural and sporting boycotts were absolutely crucial in the struggle in South Africa, as were academic boycotts. And, you know, you always hear from those opposed to them, from those supporting the regime, that, oh my gosh, the people this is here are hurting most are the oppressed in that country, which is always a complete nonsense, obviously. And that's why progressive cultural workers, sports people, and academics in South Africa were very supportive of the boycotts. I think your broader question about about culture and media generally, there are two things I want to say. The first is the ownership structures that you were talking about in terms of the arms industry. They're not dissimilar when you look at the ownership structures of media and companies that dominate the cultural landscape. And I think we need to understand that, because I think the greatest failing in the so-called West, in what Francesca Albanese, I think very appropriately calls the global minority, the greatest failing has been our media, who have completely abdicated their role as the fourth estate, who are generally the commercial and mainstream media. They don't question power. They are part of power. They are part of the apparatus of power. And obviously alternative media has emerged over years and is growing. But I think part of the reason for the collapse of the media speaking any form of truth to power, the reason that so much commercial culture no longer, like at the Berlinale, artists and art has nothing to do with politics. Yeah, really. Is because of the financial interests behind it, and people realize where their bread is buttered, to put it crudely. And that places an enormous emphasis on progressive and radical cultural workers. And I think, the role of culture in struggle, we sometimes overlook. And coming from a country like South Africa, when in our first ever convening of our first ever democratic parliament, there was singing, there was dancing, there was an extraordinary jazz band called the African Jazz Pioneers, who had been banned in 1955 and hadn't been able to play. They were now all in their 70s and 80s. And they performed in our parliament during a sitting of parliament to remind us the role that culture had played in our struggle. And I think it's something that we need to think about very, very seriously in these struggles. And it's not just at the obvious level, the level of boycotting Eurovision. I'm sorry, I'm of an age where to be able to boycott Eurovision I regard as being an advantage and a privilege, but that just comes from maybe a different perception of the whole notion of Eurovision. But that's the most obvious manifestation of it, and it's symbolically quite important. But I think it's really important in terms of our attitude towards commercialized, corrupted culture generally. And the flip side of that is really focusing on the culture of our struggles.
I cannot say anything about culture itself, but someone reacting to what Andrew just said. Actually, we can act on all of the fields, from culture to housing, labor to military industry, because everywhere we see the same ownership structure, you said, the same vested interest of not only producer companies but these financial actors. And probably for example, that this term, the military industrial complex, has also started to be used in the last 10 years in analyzing real estate development and using this syntagma of real estate financial complex. So, and this suggests that everywhere we have these big, few financial investors, asset management companies, private equity firms, and they are all over, and they are very organized, and they are interconnected with states and local businesses, and therefore our fights are so difficult to take. Because how can you fight against this big five, this big three, or whatever, how many they are, So they don't really care. Maybe they leave from a country, but then they travel to other countries, or this scheme of free movement of capital refers also to the free movement of financial capital. So what kind of instruments do we have to make these people suffer? or we can shame them or whatever, but I'm not sure that they are interested in that. Yeah, and I guess our international organizing is much weaker than the international organizing of capital, including financial capital. That's a problem I see.
Andrew's answer has covered me, but I would like to add something. The flip side of the cultural or scientific or academic boycott is enhancing the people that are on our side and producing culture ourselves. Because I don't think, for example, that there is a struggle I want to participate in where everybody is, only militaristic soldiers not interested in having fun with each other, spending time together, and so on. So the flip side of it is producing our own culture and listening our own culture. And I would like to make another comment. I mean, unfortunately, we live also in times where cultural work is precarious almost everywhere across the board. Artists are much more than the ones that end up being famous or millionaires. We need to support art produced with simple means in our neighborhoods, and it is a key part of the struggle, taking away this cultural dictating monopole by the ones that possess it. And then, unfortunately, again, due to social media, we have an overproduction of audiovisual material, and what the far right, like Enigo actually hinted, is very good in, is feeling the internet with, I'm gonna swear now, bullshit. Like the internet is full of garbage. And we have to find the way to produce our own garbage, but let's say in a imaginative way. Our garbage is, is not this kind of plastic garbage that takes ages to decompose, but rather organic, cool, and it can be recycled and transformed to something new, but we need to do more, like we need to amplify our presence as well. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, so two here.
Hello, thank you for the wonderful presentations. I have a question inspired by Laëtitia's presentation mostly, but aimed at everybody. And I wrote it down because I can easily forget what I'm trying to say. How do you view the current discussions about extending the European Union towards Moldova, or this idea called Western Balkans, from the perspective of militarization? Is also this a strategy to preserve, I don't know, economic hegemony, or maybe there is an interest to keep this in a state of permanent periphery so that they can be exploited from the perspective of cheap labor force? I don't know, how do you view this relation with the European Union's extension and the militarization? This is the question.
I'm not sure I have a more appropriate question because I'm going to resolve it. I haven't followed in details all the process, but I assume it's also in parallel with something. There are a lot of names and weird acronyms at EU level, so at European level. There is also this idea of having a European community, political community now, EPC, which I think has been pushed quite a lot by the French in particular, to try to have something a bit wider than not only EU countries, but including other countries at the periphery of the EU. So far, that may be integrated later on, to discuss more about more high-level policy and defense. It's a bit of a vague thing, but I think it really goes very much in line with what you've been mentioning about how this area could be a form of backyard. I would say first could be suppliers, where you could get some suppliers for components or elements like that that might be cheaper to produce there than it is to produce in France or in Germany. You could imagine also, yeah, a bit this idea of having them also like clients. Because once you start selling the weapons to those people, then you also have all the follow-up behind, you know, long-term service, providing components, preparation, maintenance. So the issue of selling arms is not just about, especially when you speak about complex systems, it's not about, okay, it's a one-shot, no, because behind that you have all the several years of follow-up that goes within it. So I would probably see it as part of this competition, which for me is more a competition, as I mentioned before, between the US and other newcomers in the arms sector. You mentioned Turkey or Brazil or India, etc., which are each of them trying to reach a new zone, a new area, a new market share, let's say. And in those funding we've been mentioning about the EU, especially these safe loans and for the acquisition part, there is one more idea that at least part of there is a certain threshold that should be European to an extent. But we also see that this concept of what is European is going wider. It was supposed to be only EU, and now it's becoming wider in terms of origin, but it's also important, for example, I didn't enter in the details because it's technical, but about exports. Intra-EU transfers and export, they are connected. And there is this idea of facilitating transfers of weapons within the EU, but there are proposals to change that to a more European concept, which would include European countries with whom there are partnerships between the EU and those countries. So you could very much imagine that there is this idea that there should be part of this wider vision of Europe as, and include them into this kind of conflicting vision of the world, us versus whether Russia for the official narrative or versus US or China in terms of market share for arms.
Maybe more generally speaking, just one idea that incorporating these countries would mean expanding the economic influence on for the benefit of Western imperialism, and as it also happened with all the other East European former state socialist countries, that was actually the stake, no? In need of new spaces for capital investment and markets and cheap labor force, and also the need to prove that there is no alternative to capitalism. So actually, somehow that was our role, among others, in this reshaped capitalist world system, right? To show that there is no socialist future, state socialism failed, so this is the best of our democracy, as you said, that money can buy.
May I add something to that? I think, to be honest, I'm going to advertise Vlad because he wrote a really good report in February where he illustrates in the case of Romania quite good. But you know, entering the European Union, there seems to be always a conditionality in this, right? Like the strong European economies always have had conditionalities with dealing with the rest of the world. So for years, until let's say recently, the conditionality was, you want to be part of us, you need to brutalize people at your border. That was the conditionality, practically. You want to enter, you need to brutalize people at your border. I'm sure, I mean, obviously the reasons for this conditionality with Moldova have been said, but think about, for example, the workers from Eastern European countries, and I include Greece to the east as it is south and east at the same time, and how the last 20 years the youth has been leaving our countries with direction to Germany, France, and wherever they can find a job. And this is real extraction, something that Vlad also mentioned before. It's real extraction. It's not the same with, you know, extracting lithium from a Serbian mine, but extracting people and forcing brain drain is also extraction. Also because our parents and our grandparents paid the taxes and paid the public education systems that made us to engineers, blah, 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 blah. And I think when it becomes really scary, this kind of flexibility they have in name calling the eastern flank of Europe, because there is now this thing called Western Balkans. I find it also very amusing, I have to say. But look at Ukraine. For decades, after 89, Ukrainian women were the most trafficked women in the EU. And we're talking about slavery conditions where they were kidnapped in young age, trafficked, took away their passports. And all of a sudden, where the economic interest was there for the EU and where, securing the eastern flank became the first prerogative, because obviously the deals with Putin didn't work out. Another chapter, because almost every big politician in Germany, for example, has had dealings with Putin with absolutely zero problems up to 2014. When all of a sudden the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian women and the Ukrainian youth became Western European. And this kind of flexibility is something we need to interrogate. Now, not meaning that we should abandon the idea of a European common culture or a European common future. This is something I personally would very much favor, but not within the conditions and the institutions that are now Western dominated and practically oblivious to the realities of people in the European peripheries. I hope that makes sense.
Hello. My question would be a kind of continuation of this man's question. It is for all the participants, but especially for Andrew. I would like to hear a practical advice what to do. I represent the Republic of Moldova. So now we are in the process of beginning of integration with the European Union. And as said Russian writer, he said, we live in very interesting times, actually. We see all the tensions and all the process from the very beginning, the militarization from the zero in our republic, and intensification of the relationship with Israel. And the prophylaxis is always easier than fight with the problem, like to make a prophylaxis for the problem. So we, as representatives of civil society, what can we do in this situation? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think the first thing in the sort of situation that you're talking about is information. I think a crucial role, and we'll discuss this on the panel tomorrow around journalism as well, but I have a very broad notion of journalism. I think that active citizens have a crucial role to play in bringing out the information that those in power, and I don't mean just political power, as much economic power that you're obviously completely intertwined now, does not want in the public domain. So I think that is the foremost thing, and it's one of the reasons Ruth and I tomorrow are doing an investigative methods workshop. And if you can't make it tomorrow, we also do them online regularly, which makes it easier to do in geographically diverse places. Simply to train people in some very basic methodologies, and it's not complicated. If I can figure it out, the technology of it really isn't complicated. As to quite simple ways to investigate, mainly the money flows around all of these things that you're talking about. Because at the end of the day, my own feeling is it's difficult to change people's minds in a lot of our countries on the basis of a purely ideological or moral argument. And so a lot of the arguments I think we have to make now have to be about the impact on people's day-to-day material lives. So, for instance, in the UK, we've just gone through local elections, literally a couple of days ago. And one of the key challenges was getting people to understand why talking about militarism, talking about the genocide in Gaza, the illegal wars in Lebanon and Iran, actually relate to local politics is because we are seeing these constant increases in our defence spending. Our government in the UK, for instance, is planning to increase our defence budget by over £15 billion in the 2027 fiscal year, having increased it by almost £3.5 billion since they've been in office, and pointing out to people that this is the reason our health service is unable to provide a whole lot of the services that it used to provide. This is the reason we're still in a cost of living crisis. No, it's not actually about just the attack on Iran. It's actually about political choices that are being made about how our money as taxpayers is being used by those in power. And that money is being used not for the benefit of ordinary people or for investment in our communities. So my own instinct is, and look, I'm not sure I'm the best person to talk about it. You know, we had some success in South Africa, but I've been doing this work on militarism for 25 years, and as long as the world's got more peaceful. So these are just my thoughts, more than any sort of divine inspiration. My instinct is that what we need to focus on is the way in which things that we're so concerned about, which are so intertwined with our politics, with our economics, are affecting people's daily lives. But the only way we can do that is to do that primary research, is to do the investigative research that shows what monies are going around in all of these things that are being proposed. So for instance, you know, greater closeness with the EU. What is that meaning for your political class? Who is benefiting from it? What does it mean from the economic elite in your country? And to put those sorts of amounts of money into people's minds and then talk about what they're being deprived of as a consequence of the money going to those places. For me, I think that is the sort of focus of a lot of our activities at the moment.
It's also important how you interpret all this. Let's say you have all the information, and what do you do with that? Because we see in Romania, for example, that even, well, we had much longer time to discuss about this and figure out what's happening. So even if some people emphasize how Western companies are making profit in Romania and why all this regime change had to happen, you know, those people are stigmatized as being kind of savage or primitive. They are told, oh, they are so stupid people. They speak about we don't want to sell our country, but that's a stupid thing. So, you know, the question of how you construct a counter discourse against all these stigmatizing critical voices. And again, I'm sure that in your country too, as we were told in 1990, there is no other way to be, just to access the European Union. I guess this argument repeats itself. And there is no alternative. And even today, when our government was dismissed due to its austerity policies, people are marching in Bucharest or other big cities for under a pro-European umbrella. I mean, still the argument of being pro-European, it's fucking empty, but it's still used to, you know, justify any austerity and militarization policies. And if you are not pro-European, you are pro-Russian.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
I understand completely what Eniko says. I just want to say that the difficulty that I see, because I saw it at least in Greece when we had these discussions, are we staying or are we leaving before Brexit ever happened? Was pioneered. I do understand, for example, the need and the wish of people to have freedom of movement within the EU. I do understand the fear that by not understanding the need to have the freedom of movement is also a kind of privileged position, to be honest. I mean, personally, I have, for example, friends that are from Bosnia and friends that are from Croatia, and the differences in the everyday life for those that could travel freely and for those that can't and are dependent on the next, paperwork is big. But still, you need, if there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 positive, you don't pay roaming on your phone. Yeah, we have all the same charger, stuff like this. GDPR is a good thing in terms of Palantir. There are things that are good, but what I would definitely cautious everyone is to slip into this, we have the shared Western values. I think this is a completely empty significant. I do not, and I know that this is the case for a lot of people, identify with Merz or von der Leyen or even Meloni. Even Greeks and Italians are culturally quite close. And we need to feel this empty significant with our own content. And for example, like Andrew said, does the EU really mean free press? We need to support free press. Does the EU really mean freedom of movement? And we need to support freedom of movement for everyone. Would that mean a better welfare state? I have a lot of question marks on that. But if we do, then we need to support every welfare state's struggle everywhere. So don't be carried away, be cautious. But I would think, for example, telling Moldavians they're wrong for wanting to be part of the EU would be quite arrogant, coming from a position where...
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think it's a lot has been said already. And yeah, I agree with this idea that the struggle is much wider than just EU or wider European or not, and it's at the same time very local. So we have to fight with what we have in our hands, or try and change things according to our situation. And there are a lot of things to criticize about the EU. However, I'm not sure that the situation would be much better if there was no EU, because this is a global trend. Being more from my country, in France, the fact that the far right is at the door of power, it's not because of the EU. So there are also this, and I fully agree that we need to relativize and not to be focused so much on very specific questions which have anyway a very complex answer according to the point of view. The most important is really to act also in terms of where you sit and where you can more broadly consider about how to fight militarisation, more globally speaking, and so on. Well, we also need to be aware there are no miracle solutions, no short-term solutions, and we need to act each other's where we are good at. Sometimes there are also some discussions about whether we should all do the same thing, or all of this, or all of that. There is so much to do that. Just where you are good at, and where you can draw people. The simple fact that because you're very good at communication, or you're very good in doing social media, or talking with your friends, and bring them with information and elements that make them suddenly think, maybe it's more complicated than what I've been told so far. And you change one person's mind, that's already amazing. We need to be ready when the momentum will be there for us. And while trying to be ready for the momentum, we contribute to have this momentum happen. We don't know where exactly, we don't know how, we don't know when, but all these things we do little by little are the ones that will help create this momentum, and we need to be ready to seize this momentum.
Thank you. I think we are now... We're a bit late, but so unfortunately we don't have any time for more questions. But we wait for you again tomorrow. We'll be starting at the same time. We will be discussing tomorrow about how we can reimagine security beyond this kind of militarized framework that is presented within the mainstream. And we'll also be looking at the role of journalism in this fight. And we will also hear from our Greek comrades about their great work, but also from other collectives in Eastern Europe, and we will and build something that makes sense here in this part of Europe. So thank you. Yes. So thank you to our speakers. And